And you will see that the talk is more general than EPR, although all the examples are drawn from electron spin resonance. It is more about our recent branching into the neural networks, and more specifically into the question of how on earth do they work so well. That was the more exciting aspect of it. Once we trained them, we realized that they're at least as good as our current best efforts at deterministic data processing. And so this is the last couple of years of our research that branched into various interesting things to do, not just with electron spin resonance, but with machine learning. And so that being the case, I decided to start from the very beginning, from the biological neuron, which, as all of you know, is a specialized type of cell that has the central body that is responsible for much of the metabolism, and where the nucleus is, it's called soma. Then it has a set of dendrites and a particularly long appendage called an axon. This can be meters long. And that terminates in the connections that it has to the other neurons. Now, if we look closely at the membrane here, we will see the usual double layer, but also a number of proteins called ion channels in it, and then some structural skeleton that keeps the cell rigid. But what we would now like to do, what I would like to show you, is exactly how a biological neuron functions, and then to connect it with the models that much later became known as artificial neural networks. So the most important part of this, the part that we are concerned with, is something called the transmembrane potential. And that comes about because of unequal concentrations of different ions on either side of this membrane. So if we look at concentrations of sodium and potassium in mammalian neuron, in the intracellular part, so inside the membrane, and the extracellular, so outside of the cell with respect to the membrane, we would notice an interesting thing. The concentration of potassium inside the neuron is quite high. In fact, remarkably high. This is millimoles. And the concentration outside is rather low. However, the concentration of sodium has the opposite profile. It is low inside the cell and rather high outside. And this is quite important because if you go through the chemical thermodynamics and find out what the corresponding transmembrane electrostatic potential is going to be, the potential difference, this just comes straight out of Gibbs free energy and Nernst's equation. We realize that there's actually a significant transmembrane potential difference, about 60 millivolts across the membrane. And if you divide it by the length of this membrane, which is not that big, you get a few megavolts per meter. So there is a pretty strong electric field across the neuron. Now, that is an important part of it. And I would remind you that we have about 100 billion neurons in the human brain. Okay, so what happens? Why does this transmembrane potential appear? It appears because there are active ion pumps that are embedded in that membrane. It's ATP driven, so it splits ATP and it picks up sodium from inside the cell and it transports it. So ATP gets cleaved into phosphate and ADP, and then it absorbs 3 units of sodium ions and it tries and transports them on the outside where there is potassium and it's got some binding pockets for potassium. At the next stage, it releases the sodium into the outside of the cell and it binds 2 units of potassium. Note that it's 3:2. And then at the next stage, potassium is released into the intracellular medium and phosphate is released as well. Now, this maintains the transmembrane potential. So it's an active pump that's driven by ATP that takes sodium outside and brings potassium in. There are also sodium channels and potassium channels that are voltage gated. If at some point the transmembrane potential drops, so if the voltage is reduced, these channels open and they allow sodium into the cell, at which point the transmembrane potential drops even further. And after it's dropped to a certain sufficient point, it has this blockage unit that blocks the channel, and there is no further transfer happening. So why am I telling you this, and why is this important? As you will see, we will need to capture all of that in the mathematical model of the neuron that will eventually make up our artificial neural network. Okay, so let's take a look at what happens. So our equilibrium resting potential is 60 millivolts with a minus sign. And let's imagine that something from the outside has come and perturbed this potential to minus 40, which is called the threshold potential. At that point, the sodium channel, the voltage-gated channel, opens, and sodium rushes into the cell. Remember, there's a lot of it outside and little of it inside. As soon as that happens, the transmembrane potential drops further and actually shoots into positive, at which point the next stage happens and the potassium channels open. But of course, potassium goes into the opposite direction. And remember that the sodium channels are now blocked by that little blockage appendage. And of course, potassium is transported in the opposite direction. And so we have a restoration of this potential. And at some point, it overshoots even further down than minus 60, at which point the potassium channels are blocked. And we have a gradual return into the resting potential at that point. So eventually the membrane returns to its resting stage, but this spike is characteristic, and this is what it's caused by. Now, think about what's going to happen as soon as we have this perturbation. The adjacent region of the neuron will get itself below the threshold, and we will have a traveling wave. So essentially what is happening, and this is how the signal is transported down the membrane and eventually down the axon, is that a perturbation in the transmembrane voltage causes this sequence of events, which then causes the same sequence of events next door, and this entire wave just travels at between 1 and 100 meters per second, depending on the organism, down the axon. As soon as it reaches the junction, it's called a synapse, between this neuron and the next, there are voltage-gated calcium channels in there which also react to the arrival of this wave. They get themselves opened, and at that point, these vesicles, synaptic vesicles that contain a chemical substance called neurotransmitter, they open into this synaptic cleft, and they bind to a different set of ion channels, which then open and cause a membrane depolarization at the next neuron, at which point the entire procedure is repeated at the next neuron. If there's sufficient amount of voltage drop, there's a further signal propagation. And so we have this body of the cell into which multiple junctions come in. And so if the totality of the potential perturbations that they have brought in have accumulated to a sufficient amount to generate the action potential at this neuron, there's a signal going out of the next one. So essentially what a neuron does is it collects, moderates, and processes electrical signals in a nonlinear fashion, and then it passes a signal on. So how would we model something like this? So essentially we have an object that collects incoming signals, does something nonlinear to them, and then passes the signal out. Well, let's just think about it. We can model all these inputs as some numbers that are coming in. Depending on how the neuron is organized, different inputs would have different importance, and this is called weights. So they're multiplied by different numbers that the neuron has to learn as a result of some biological process. There's a certain parameter that determines the extent to which this neuron is already ready to fire. So how sensitive it is, and that's called a bias. All of that is summed up, and then there's an activation function. If it's below a certain threshold, nothing happens. If it's above a certain threshold, it fires and produces the output. And so there's a moderation function here, which is likely nonlinear, and that is the simplest possible mathematical model of a biological neuron. So let's now make an equation for this. A vector goes in, gets scalar multiplied into a set of numbers, summed up, another scalars added in through the function on the outside. So we receive the signals on each of the inputs, we apply coefficients to each signal, we add the bias, we pass it through the activation function, and that's the mathematics of it. So a sum of all the inputs times the weights plus the bias through a nonlinear function on the output. So each individual xk is a scalar, and the output here is a scalar as well. Now, in 1943, so as early as that, a remarkable theorem was proven about networks of such objects. For any well-behaved function and for any target accuracy, there is a finite network of such neurons that outputs that function to that accuracy. So it's a universal approximator, the network of such objects. And then, okay, if we have our set of inputs, they can go into this neuron, into this neuron, into that neuron. So a stack of neurons is called a layer. Then they will be weighted and accumulated and passed through this nonlinear activation function to produce a set of outputs, as many as there are neurons in the first layer. They are then connected to the next layer of neurons, and it passes the output to the next layer. And this is the standard multi-layer artificial neural network. So networks are made out of connected layers of neurons. Conventionally, in principle, you can have an arbitrary topology there, and such networks also exist, but this is the most popular type. Okay, so the output of the previous layer forms the input of the next, and this is the mathematics of it, right? A vector goes in, so this is now a vector, gets multiplied at each individual neuron. This was a vector, but we now have multiple, so it's a matrix. This is called a weight matrix, plus a bias vector through the nonlinear function times the next weight matrix, plus a bias vector through the nonlinear function times the next weight matrix, plus a bias vector through the nonlinear function. This is just glorified matrix vector arithmetic. So after the dust has settled on all the biological inspiration and all the topological connectivity here in the neural net, the result is actually pretty basic linear algebra with some nonlinear functions in between. So these weight matrices and these bias vectors are parameters of the neural network. These functions are usually sigmoidal. There's little response to the input if the input is weak, and there's also the maximum response above which a neuron cannot physically go. It either fires or it doesn't, and so the biological approximation to a step function is a sigmoid. Sometimes it's an actual step function. People have started experimenting with more complicated things, but sigmoids are the most popular transfer functions. Okay, so what about training? You've all heard about this, great big amount of marketing around it. It's just basically least squares. There's nothing more to it. If we have just a simple case here of a single layer, then we know, for example, from a database, there's a set of inputs and there's a set of outputs, and we basically just least squares this with respect to the W's and the B's, and that's it. So we set up our experimental data, that's the output, that's the network with the inputs, that minus that square. So with, as a function of the weights and biases, minimize this with respect to weights and biases using some gradient descent or conjugate gradients or whatnot. So this is actually quite simple. And this was pretty clear to people in the 50s, but what they underestimated at the time by, I would imagine, about at least 9 orders of magnitude. They underestimated the computing power that is needed for this to actually start working. The game really changed around 2015. when NVIDIA came up with the latest generations of its Tesla cards, which are orders of magnitude faster than even the latest CPUs now, but it does cost an arm and a leg. Modern Tesla cards begin at £10,000. So, but as soon as you have them, you can stack a sufficient number of these neurons together into a sufficiently large number of layers that it starts showing this impressive performance that you have seen on the BBC. And if you have multiple layers here, you just stack them, and when you do the derivative, you just use the chain rule. That is called backpropagation neural network training. It's basically glorified least squares with a chain rule. There's absolutely nothing else to it. It's just bloody big. Okay, so that's a fairly typical fully connected small-ish network. A vector goes in, times a matrix plus a vector through a sigmoid, times a matrix plus a vector through a sigmoid. You know, if you know the answer here experimentally, least squares against this, pass it forward, some other answer, least squares against that. Differentiate with respect to all the elements of W's and B's here, least squares against experimental data. So applications, you've seen them, right? Nonlinear, non-uniform data analysis, sound, voice, handwriting recognition, things like that. Object classification, nonlinear signal processing that we will see now. Actually surrogate solutions to partial differential equations as well. That's a typical image recognition network. It actually, the performance is pretty good these days. It's not just a hat, but a hat with a wide brim, as you can see. But an important point is network is only as good as the training database. If you train the network to recognize the dogs and you gave it some pasta, this is what it's going to see. It dogifies the pasta internally. It's actually pretty close to what human visual chain produces in schizophrenia. So all sorts of interesting insight emerged into us because we are neural networks too. And importantly, the training is computationally very expensive, but once it's trained, it's just a bunch of matrix vector operations. It's really cheap to use a network once it's been trained. Right, those are the generalities. Let us now go into our good old electron spin resonance and to our practical use case. Nobody in this audience needs an introduction to DEER. It's a spin echo, glorified spin echo, which has been messed with on the other electron. So if we have this echo and we have a pulse on the other electrons, the echo gets modulated as a function of that position, and that's your standard DEER trace or quantum bits, as the quantum people are calling it. Straightforward theory, if you have 2-point spin half particles, once you go through the mass at each particular distance, so the dipole coupling is proportional to 1 over distance cubed, you have this general mathematical form, a Fresnel function of that times a trigonometric function of this 1 over root that, and this is called a kernel. And that is called a kernel because it's actually the Green's function of a certain differential equation for the delta function distance distribution. And if you have some specific distance distribution in your biological system, it's an integral of that Green's function against the distance distribution in question. So that's your kernel, that's your distance distribution, and that's your experimental data, plus or minus the noise that you expect to see. And that's a typical distance distribution that people with a complicated biological system are going to have. Also called pulsed electron double resonance, PELDOR, hundreds of papers, you've seen them all, from nanotech to structural biology. So typically used as a ruler. A lot of instrumentation work on the subject, can use it for proteins, can use it for nucleic acids. Those of you who are new to Stefan's group will at some point be exposed to all of this as a part of your background reading. Right, so what we record is these modulations. What we want is distance distributions, and there are complications in the way. We have noise, both additive and multiplicative, before it can be compared with experimental data, to a point that when we are trying to extract this P of R out of experimental data, there are many solutions, and most of them are wrong. That's a good example of how it goes wrong, and this is also an example for which all the standard ways of processing data uniformly fail. This is a gold nanoparticle that has been functionalized, and there are unpaired electrons placed on two of these molecules, right? So these are, I think, sulfonated or SH terminated aliphatic chains, and then you have a nitroxide at the end of them. If you do the statistics of how a pair is to be distributed on the surface of such a nanoparticle, it is supposed to have a peak and then a smooth pedestal. And as you can see, the standard regularized processing corrupts this pedestal. Another problem that you often see is external interactions like exchange coupling that don't fit into the mathematical model. And so in, for example, these molecules, when you measure distances between these two copper ions, you get the true distance, but also a great amount of distortions because of this exchange coupling between those electrons. And essentially the band-aid, right, what is currently perhaps the most widely used method, is to look for a solution that is in some sense regular. It's either smooth or it's sparse or it's small, and typical condition being that it is smooth. So what we have is the usual least squares. This is experimental data, that's our integral, that minus that, norm squared. And then the measure of smoothness of the signal is, for example, the norm of the second derivative. If something is smooth, the second derivative is going to be small. If something is rough, it's going to be big. And so the norm of the second derivative is a serviceable measure of how smooth the signal is. And it's nothing more than philosophy, right? And the second derivative measure, we just plucked it out of thin air and plonked a coefficient in front of it. And we hope that the totality of this, how good the fit is, plus how smooth it is going to kind of work, and it generally does. But despite 2 decades of work, as you can imagine, the process of choosing this alpha and then assessing the error, I don't need to explain this particular laboratory, because you guys are the world leading group in both finding this alpha and estimating the uncertainties of all of this. Okay, now we thought, okay, fine. So Gunnar Jeschke and company and Thomas Prisner have come up with the ways of processing these things about 15 years ago. And then you guys in Seattle are currently leading on the uncertainty estimation. We thought, okay, but still problems unsolved. And at some point we thought, why don't we just try a neural network to try and train some things that would solve, because it's vector in, vector out, and our dear estimation problem is vector in, vector out. We had the obvious problem. You need millions of data sets in order to constrain that neural network. Those matrices, if it's a 512 element vector going in, have matrices of dimension of 512 by 512. So that's the order of 1 million parameters per network. So we need millions of data points. And there's not enough such data in the world, and we don't have the time to curate it. So we tried to train it on simulations. And simulations in some is something we are really good at because of spinach. It's actually quite easy to launch 1 million instances of spinach on a large cluster and just generate 1 million instances of synthetic Deer traces, and then to artificially add all the noise, all the distortions, everything that can possibly go wrong. So we have this synthetic reality, as we called it in a grant application, because you're supposed to be poetic in a grant application, generated 1 million structural ensembles, ran 1 million simulations, added 1 million instances of all the noises and all the baselines and everything and so on. And Gunnar has coached us through the process of modeling of everything that can possibly go wrong in a real instrument. And then we train it. And then as soon as we have the real reality, this problem of recovering that from this, that's hard and stable and ill post, we send it through the neural net, hope and pray that it works. Okay, so spinach helped because it's 15 years of large-scale simulation research that we were able to use to generate this database. So how do we do it? Okay, generate a great big bunch of distance distributions. ran the simulations to generate a great bunch of clean deer traces, take into account everything that can possibly go wrong in an instrument, and then you have this realistic data set. And we've got a general orientation selective shaped pulse deer PELDOR module that can even do, even gadolinium if we must. But the more quantum mechanical the simulation becomes, the further away it goes from, 2-point spin halves, the harder it is to simulate. Anyway, we were rather bemused by how well the thing worked. And then the obvious question of uncertainty quantification came up, and we decided, okay, why don't we generate 100 different databases, train 100 different networks, and then look at the extent to which they agree. If the networks agree completely, even though they have been trained on independent databases, chances are the answer is right. If they start disagreeing, then we can do the statistics. So it's a different kind of bootstrap. It's not a bootstrap with respect to data. This is bootstrap at the level of neural network training. If the networks cannot agree on what the answer is, chances are there simply isn't the information in your data set that constrains that answer. And so philosophically, this is how uncertainty quantification is commonly done in machine learning. You train a bunch of neural networks against different databases, and then you see, you quantify the extent to which they agree. And if they do agree for a reasonably sort of iffy data set, then you do get the statistics and your average. And if the data set becomes really corrupted, then all the networks disagree. And so the bonus was that this approach actually fails gracefully when you have no data that constrains your distance distribution. It just outputs complete uncertainty here. Okay, so we went through the entire catalog that has been supplied with deer analysis, and networks usually agree reasonably well, and the 95% confidence interval, as you can see, is pretty narrow. So bimodal distributions are fine, broad distributions are fine. Initially, we had different networks for narrow and broad, but now we managed to get enough compute power to train one super monstrous network that actually covers everything. Really narrow distributions at short range, sharp bimodal. In all cases, we got the answers that were indistinguishable from the answers that Gunnar gave us based on his best effort in deer analysis. So we are doing at least as well as a highly competent human. But that was 10 hours of unattended training versus 10 years of programming in the case of deer analysis. So it went unusually well. And then the guys in ETH were kind enough to compile a list of really difficult problems for us where they knew that deer analysis was struggling. So for example, these baseline artifacts, neural networks either don't have them or correctly output complete uncertainty for them. This pedestal, remember, I had it. This is something where you have a sharp peak next to a broad peak. Any model-free fit, regularized model-free fit here fails. Neural network didn't. I was actually quite concerned about this because I didn't know what this really was, and I saw this, and I thought, goodness knows what this is, but I'll send it anyway, and it turned out that neural network actually correctly reproduced the pedestal where Tikhonov had failed. So at least in this case, we are doing better, because if you under-regularize in Tikhonov, you get this. If you over-regularize, you get this smooth, featureless thing that broadens the sharp peak. So in this particular case, the network works fundamentally better than Tikhonov. And then, of course, Chris Timmel and Sabine came around with the exchange coupled data. And we thought, well, okay, in that great big equation, exchange and dipolar couplings occur separately. And so in principle, we could try and train the net to demodulate the exchange. And we were pleased to see that that is what is happening. Unfortunately, only in the case when you have a single exchange coupling. Gunnar's group has demonstrated since, they published it like last week. If you have a distribution of exchange couplings, the network also fails, but that's because the distribution of exchange couplings is equivalent to a Fourier transform of an arbitrary function. And then, of course, it's not possible to distinguish your Dietrich trace from an arbitrary function. And so when it's supposed to fail, it fails. But at least if you have a single exchange coupling in the system, that works pretty well. So you recover 25 angstroms, even though this modulation looks like a much shorter distance. And then if you snip one of the bonds on that big superring, then the distance doesn't change much, but the exchange coupling changes a lot. So the modulation becomes much slower, but we still recover more or less 25 angstroms, even though the exchange coupling is wildly different here. So it looks like it can go beyond the standard Tikhonov reg, because we can train it on quantum mechanical simulations. So we have since trained it for gadolinium, so it kind of slowly begins to work. Jake, a student in my group, Jake Keeley, is at the moment working on this. Okay, so we sent it for publication and predictably got some really concerned reviewers. The reviewer 3, the famous one, said, well, Pooh, you've only trained it on 3 random Gaussians. That's just, you know, database lookup. Why don't you take a network that's been trained on 3 Gaussians and give it 4? And he said, or she said, if you see the 4 peaks, then I'm blessing it for publication. And lo and behold, we gave it 4 peaks and it output 4 peaks. So something here is not a database lookup, not an interpolant. The network apparently was solving honestly and diligently what is Fredholm's equation of the first kind. Now, that's weird, right? A model fitter would be boring. A database lookup would be boring. But from what we saw, the network was actually evolving itself to solve a partial differential equation, integral differential in this case. So it's a Fredholm solver. So the good question is, how does it actually solve an integral equation? And this is where interesting things begin. Now, philosophically, okay, so that paper got published and fine, all right, it works. But we landed with a very philosophical problem. It's a bloody black box. It's not compatible with the positivist and reductionist philosophy of science. So these 2 gentlemen here, René Descartes and Karl Popper, are sort of looking at us with some reproach that you guys better not be using a black box because it's not compatible with the philosophical framework of modern science. And so we started thinking, okay, how do we open the black box? What is the principal problem here? The principal problem is that, okay, in this function that we have, the input is ordered, it's time ordered. This x vector is a Dietrich trace. The output is distance ordered. But of course, the intermediate linkages between these matrices don't have to be ordered in any particular way, right? There's an arbitrary unitary transformation sitting here and here and here. And so if you look at these matrices, because they don't have to be ordered in any particular way, and you begin from a random initial guess, they look like random noise. So the intermediate linkage dimensions between the layers are completely scrambled by a random unitary transformation. And this is why a neural network is a black box. Okay, we thought, black box. Why don't we think of some wiretap? Even though the intermediate linkage signals here look like noise, and they really do. We just looked inside, absolutely uninterpretable. You know, vector goes in, random noise, random noise, random noise, random noise, and then the right answer mysteriously pops out. Okay, we thought, let us assume that a transformation exists that descrambles this, makes it interpretable. We need a measure of interpretability, right? This is the transformation that somehow makes the signal that comes out of this matrix humanly readable. And the extent to which it's humanly readable, we will call a lambda. It's some kind of functional. We don't know what it is. And we want to maximize or minimize whatever this is, right? Essentially maximize human readability. Okay, so let's think about what these operators are expected to be. Well, they're expected to be linear, right? Because a linear combination of signals has to be descrambled into a linear combination of the corresponding answers. They're expected to be differentiable, right? They're smooth. They're expected to be invertible because information cannot be lost. So p minus 1 must always exist. And they're clearly multiplicative in the structure of the network in here. So actually, this is where Stefan's remark of me having spent 20 years doing spin physics comes into play. This is a Lie group. And we know everything about Lie groups in spin physics. If you've done spin physics for 20 years, that's your best friend. Okay, good. That's a Lie group. Decent. What kind of a Lie group it is? Well, it's a continuous group, and this is probably not very far from orthogonal transformations, right? We commonly encounter this in digital signal processing, things like Fourier transform. So, and it also has to be a supergroup of the permutation group. So it has to connect the permutation group with a discrete subgroup. If you've boiled in this kettle long enough, you would realize that the only decent candidate there is the special orthogonal group. We are always a real field here. It cannot be SUN, so it has to be SON. But then the group is connected to its generator algebra by a really nasty transformation called the matrix exponential. From a computational point of view, it's an absolute horror. It's hard to differentiate, it's expensive, and so on. So we'd rather not exponentiate. But thankfully, there is an obscure transformation, again, only known to spin physicists, more or less, that is equivalent to having the exponential map. It's called the Cayley transform, where the generator is real antisymmetric matrix, and it generates your unitary, well, orthogonal matrix that is in that group. And this is much easier to compute and much nicer to differentiate, because we will need to maximize or minimize here. Anyway, about a couple of months of programming later, we found a metric. We want to do exactly the same as what the Tikhonov people do. We say, okay, if we put a huge database of signals here, and there comes out a huge database of signals at the linkage, if they're all simultaneously smooth, they probably all simultaneously make sense. It's a bit of an assumption, but let's try. And so we decided to optimize Tikhonov smoothness in here to try and find these transformations that descrambles our neural network. So Tikhonov smoothness is the norm of the derivative. So if that's a differentiation matrix and that's the Frobenius norm, we want to minimize this. That is a matrix functional, and we need to differentiate a functional of a matrix with respect to another matrix that goes into the Cayley transform. Another month of linear algebra later, Jake Amy is a hero. We have it. Okay, so that's the input database, that's the activation function, that's the generator of our algebra that goes into the group, that's the derivative. That's the interpretation quality gradient, and that is basically what we dump into the GPU. Other descrambling criteria are possible. If you expect your signals to be local, you can enforce locality. If you expect certain, I don't know, luminosity, chromaticity, autocorrelation, domain-specific definition of interpretable can go into this functional, and then you minimize or maximize this. So we took the simplest possible DEERNet, vector in times a matrix through the function times another matrix vector out, and wrote the code which we call the Descrambler group. So essentially, it's an LBFGS quasi-Newton minimizer for this, and the generator is varied from a random initial guess against the simultaneous smoothness of about 100,000 signals from the database. Anyway, that is the original weight matrix. So if you just take the DEERNet, pluck a weight matrix out, look at it, it makes absolutely no sense. It looks like noise. One of the dimensions is ordered because that's the Deer trace, but the output dimension is completely disordered. No matter how much you stare at this, it makes no sense. After the descrambling transformation, it begins to make sense. You see these strange interlocking wave patterns. So something happened, right? So a wave went in, so the input dimension is vertical here, and some other wave apparently went out of that layer once we descrambled the linkage. So wave in, wave out, some kind of digital filter. Okay, we saw digital filter. We need to Fourier transform to find out. So do a two-dimensional Fourier transform to see it in the frequency space. Whoa. Okay, so that's the Fourier transform of this filter. So this is what it does in the frequency space. Instant, immediate, it's a bandpass, right? It multiplies all of these frequencies and all of those frequencies by 0. Stuff goes in that dimension, stuff comes out in that dimension. High frequencies, both positive and negative, are chopped off. Okay, network spontaneously invented a bandpass filter. What it also multiplies by 0, apparently, is the 0 frequency. So this is what we call a notch filter in DSP. And why would it want to kill the 0 frequency? That's because that's the baseline. Our baseline has a 0 frequency. And if you zoom into it, you look at these horns in here, we thought, why on earth would it not just, kill the high frequencies? Fine, we can live with it. Kill the 0 frequency? Fine, we understand that. But why would it want to sort of non-linearly rearrange the frequencies where this non-linear rearrangement is almost perfect cubic curve? Well, turns out that's because the dipolar coupling, which then determines the distance, is a cubic function of that distance. So it's what's called a frequency rectifier. It takes a cubically arranged frequencies and rearranges them in a linear way. Now, that is a single layer. So we didn't ask it to do it. It evolved it spontaneously. The only thing we did was to find a mathematical transformation that makes this humanly readable. So the layer 1 of DEERNet spontaneously evolved a bandpass filter, a notch filter, and a frequency axis rectifier from cubic to linear, and packed it all into a linear transformation into a single layer. Now, that was getting interesting. Okay, we thought, what about the next layer in this network? Again, raw weight matrix absolutely makes no sense, right? However you look at it. Okay, apply the descrambling transformation. So what's happening in here is this is the link dimension. This is what it receives, the waves it receives, and this is the output dimension. Look, fast oscillations are mapped into this, and slow oscillations are mapped into that. So it's some kind of frequency transform again, but it maps fast oscillations, output dimension for a two-layer net is distance. So fast oscillations are mapped into short distances and slow oscillations into long distances. So it's some kind of time frequency transform, perhaps not too dissimilar to Fourier transform, but at least an orthogonal transform of some kind. Well, how do you find out what a transform does? You do singular value decomposition. You look at what it expects on the input, these are the input singular vectors, and you look at what it outputs, those are the output singular vectors, and the singular values are the amplification coefficients, right? You guys know that perfectly because, in fact, your software uses that to an extent. Okay, now, this matrix turns out to be left orthogonal and right orthogonal. So if you multiply that, so if you multiply its transpose by itself, you get something that's approximately diagonal. And if you multiply it the other way around, it's also something that's approximately diagonal. So let's take a look at the input singular vectors. They turn out to be sinusoids. So it expects sinusoids at the input. The hardware that expects sinusoids of different frequencies at the input is called frequency multiplexing DSP. So apparently the second layer invented frequency multiplexed signaling. If you look at the output layer, again, we have an approximately orthogonal set of output signals. And this was interesting, right? Straight line, another straight line across, something like that, and then something like that. And so this spontaneously just fell out of the network. And I was sitting at it and thinking, these are patterns, right? And for my sins, I'm teaching mathematics at Southampton Chemistry. I'm responsible for all mathematics teaching here. These are Chebyshev polynomials. And the reason why I knew that is because I was teaching them Chebyshev polynomials the day before. They just fell out spontaneously. So the network spontaneously invented Chebyshev polynomials. And it translates these oscillations into Chebyshev polynomials, which are actually patterns of peaks. And this is exactly what you expect on the output of DEERNet. So it invented Chebyshev decomposition for the output. Anyway, so output layer has spontaneously evolved, right? This is 10 hours of unattended training from a random initial guess. Frequency division multiplexing adds layer linkage. Spectral filtering regularization, because look, these oscillations are slow. It actually multiplies the fast Chebyshev polynomials, mostly by zeros. So that's the Jack Fried style spectral filtering regularization. And a Fourier-like time frequency transform that translates that into that, and it invented Chebyshev polynomials. If you are not shocked by now, you really should be, because the thing invented a significant chunk of modern mathematics spontaneously. Right? It just did it, and then it took us some effort to discover what it does, but we're not looking at anything you and I wouldn't have invented. Okay, we thought, fine, let's take a 3-layer network and look at the intermediate layer. So the entry layer, we know what it is. It's a digital filter. The output layer is a glorified Fourier transform. What about the middle layer of a 3-layer net? That was Jake Kelly that did that. And then we thought, okay, this is the descrambled layer. And again, even the descrambled one makes no sense. The scrambled one's completely just noise. Okay, we thought, fine. The output of the first one is frequencies. The input of the last one is also frequencies. So this probably has doing some frequency shuffling. So perhaps a Fourier transform is going to be a good idea anyway. Turns out it is. And then you have to look at the band of the filter, right? So all of this is zeros anyway, right? Because the previous layer filtered it out. It's diagonal and it's counter-diagonal. And if you look at what it does to the frequencies, so it swaps positive and negative frequencies, or it doesn't. And it occasionally rotates the positive and negative frequencies. So this is mostly phase rotations. So the intermediate layer, for some reason, does phase flips and phase rotations. Why would it want to do that? We thought, okay, so that's me and Jake at this point. In some metric, this transform that takes the kernel to Deer is an orthogonal transformation, right? In fact, the weight of the metric is this P of R. So it's at least homomorphous to an orthogonal transform. What do we know about the orthogonal group in general, in some weird topology? We know that it's disconnected, that it has 2 copies of special orthogonal groups. So SON is path connected, but these 2 are linked by discrete inversion operations. So there's no continuous path from this copy of SON into that copy of SON. And so any optimization algorithm that is based on continuous optimization, like gradient descent, the transformations that we seek to approximate might be in one of these copies, right? In the copies that contains the unity. And we might just end up randomly starting in that copy, unless we have a way of, moving from one to the other, we'll be stuck. And let's think about what's the nearest supergroup that's actually path connected. So this is a SON Kronecker inversion, but the path connected supergroup for this is actually SON Kronecker phase rotations. This is the famous U1 from the particle physics, from the what's it called, the standard model. And again, if you've done spin physics long enough, you know exactly what this is, right? So the only thing this is, it has to be real, otherwise it would have been SUN. Anyway, the path-connected supergroup of this that enables to transition from here to here is a phase rotation group. And this apparently what this layer has evolved to do. So our SON is path connected, our U1 is simply connected, so the whole thing is path connected, and the orthogonal group in which we seek to find this transformation is embedded into that. So the network apparently invented group embedding. Now, I doubt the audience of this seminar is sufficiently versus probably it's all Greek to you, but it illustrates the fact that a simple 3-layer, fully connected network just invented the sort of mathematics that you need to have spent 20 years learning in order to even recognize, which is mildly shocking. So all of this is now in press, it's under review, so hopefully it'll get there, but it's quite scary how much these networks just invent. Okay, so again, reviewer 3, Yeah, nice. Pose further examples, please, from outside this strange electron spin resonance stuff that you seem to be doing. Okay, so Taj Chowdhury volunteered to descramble an acoustic network. There are plenty of networks that denoise, for example, human voice. So he took some voice database, Mozilla Common Voice database, took washing machine noise, mixed them together into a noisy human voice, trained the networks so that translates short-term spectrograms and denoises them into a pure voice. And then that's how your input layer weight matrix looks. Again, utterly uninterpretable. But here the interpretability criterion is different, right? It's not supposed to be smoothness. These spectrograms are not smooth. They're picky. So it's supposed to be locality. And so what a denoising network is supposed to do is just suppress some frequencies. So we expect a diagonal matrix to just kill some frequencies in Fourier space. So we want diagonal maximization. So we want a matrix that's diagonally dominant. That one's going to be interpretable. And it turns out that yes, such a transformation exists. And we have found a low pass and some block arithmetic in a short time Fourier transform in here. And again, this descrambling transform more or less established what that denoising network was doing. This is more technical and of interest to DSP people, but we could descramble this. We thought, fine, well, not we thought, the reviewers made us. They said, well, you claim to have found out how this network works, so you should be able to recreate it by deterministic DSP now. And unless you do it, no way we're going to accept this paper. We thought, fine, challenge accepted. So we designed a filter in MATLAB that is a notch. So very, very narrow notch that just kills the zero frequency. That would be your baseline. We designed a bandpass that keeps the low frequencies and kills the high ones to roughly mimic what we saw in the first layer. And to roughly mimic what we saw in the last layer, we just did a regularized pseudo-inverse to take this pattern of oscillations into the pattern of peaks that vaguely mimics the function of the last layer that we saw. And behold, it does it. So if you take the noisy Dia trace, the low pass filter denoises it, so that's the continuous line, and then the notch kills the baseline, and so you have something smooth. And then after you apply this regularized pseudo inverse, you do actually get a reasonable agreement with the expected answer. So this is like a Frankenstein, right, that we put together using mechanical cogs. And of course, this has many parameters that you have to tweak, but this is directly inspired by how the network works. And hopefully now the reviewers are going to be kind to us. So we learned this method from the network. So we took opened the black box, realized it does a hell of a lot of mathematics we never expected to find in there. And at some point, we'll probably be able to find some mathematics we didn't know about. So these neural nets can probably be mined for new knowledge. The bottom line of all of this is the very important fact, I think, to anyone who is doing simulations, is that now that the computers are good, our great amount of experience in simulating stuff may be turned into ability to interpret data by machine learning, because we can generate those training database by simulations. So this Descrambler group method is novel. We are the first people to ever find out how exactly a fully connected network works. All the previous interpretability was for convolutional networks, where concepts exist, like image processing and so on. This is the first time we actually opened up an abstract transformation that doesn't have any identifiable features or concepts. For the descrambling, it's the same complexity as training. So if you train something on a hardware, you can also descramble it. Open source, so you will see these descramblers in the latest spinach if you look at it. So a simple 3-layer network spontaneously invented, sophisticated digital filters, spectral filtering, regularization, Chebyshev polynomials, and topological group embedding, for goodness sake. And this is fascinating and slightly scary, because this is the sort of creativity that you would normally associate with the human mind, but it does it anyway. Okay, so the last thing to do is to acknowledge. So I'd like to acknowledge a bunch of artificial neural networks and 5 natural biological neural networks and a Turing machine as well. So the original DEERNet paper was Jake, Amy, Gunnar, Jeschke, Steve Worsvik, and myself, with a lot of help from NVIDIA and MassWorks. No way you can do that without a Tesla card and without a direct line to the really awesome people at the Cambridge office of MassWorks. And then Taj and Jake have joined the project at the interpretability stage. And we just teamed up with Gunnar and Daniela Goldfarb, who is supplying us with gadolinium data. So we just got a joint grant with them. Thanks to these wonderful people. It's an interesting organization. They fund things that normally funding agencies wouldn't fund. We just wrote in the application saying, look, this is really interesting and slightly scary. Give us the money. And these guys gave us the money. So thanks a lot to Jake, Steve, Gunnar, the other Jake, and Taj, who are now working on all of this awesome stuff. And thanks to you for your attention. I'm happy to answer questions on this.